Decision making is probably the least time pressured out of the three cognitive subsections, but with that being said, most students still run out of time. According to the 2025 technical report, only 43% of students were able to answer all of the questions in the time if you exclude responses under 10 seconds. So essentially, if you exclude guessing, right? So most people aren't answering all of the questions on decision making. So that being said, how do we order the questions on decision making correctly and optimally to maximize our score, assuming we're not going to answer all of the questions? And then for students who are aiming to answer all of the questions, how do we achieve this? How do we make ourselves most likely to be able to answer all of the questions? And the answer to those two questions are slightly different. So, first, I'm going to discuss what to do on decision making if you're running out of time, if you're consistently finding yourself unable to answer all of the questions. And my first piece of advice would be to skip logic puzzles. Now, unless you're a massive fan of logic puzzles, which would put you in the minority, logic puzzles are the longest question type and also often the hardest question type. And that's a pretty universal experience that students experience. According to the technical report, again, only 52% of logic puzzles are answered correctly, which is the lowest out of any of the multiple choice questions. So syllogisms and interpreting information are lower, but that's because you have to get 5 of them right for it to count as a correct answer, right? So logic puzzles are the hardest, and according to a little bit of kind of research I did, they also take the longest. So I looked at a sample of some Medify questions, and the average time to complete a logic puzzle was 164 seconds. So if you think that you need to aim for around 60 seconds per question on decision making, 164 is obviously way longer than the average, or at least what you should be aiming for. So that's why I recommend, if you're running out of time, to literally just flag or guess all of the logic puzzles and then only come back to them if you actually finish the other questions in time. Now, of course, if you're only barely running out of time, you could possibly try to look for the hardest logic puzzles and only skip those ones. In my experience, the hardest ones are the ones where they essentially have the 4 or 5 people and then the activities or clothes or characteristics of those people, and you essentially have to match them up in that kind of table. Hopefully, if you've done some decision making practice, then you'll know what I'm talking about, and I'll put an example on screen. But those ones typically take the longest. So if you're going to skip any logic puzzles, probably make it those ones and then answer the ones that require less time. So the ones, for example, where you're looking at the order of people in the line or the order people go around a table, answer those ones first and only skip the longer ones if that applies to you. Then, if you're still running out of time after skipping all the logic puzzles, we've got another decision to make, which, quite funny given those sections called decision making. But yeah, we've got another decision to make. What question do we skip after that? And usually it comes down to either the Venn diagram questions at the kind of end section of decision making, or the interpreting information questions. So by interpreting information questions, I mean the 5 yes no ones that aren't the syllogisms. So syllogisms are the all iggles or piggles types ones, and the interpreting information questions are the ones where they have either a long paragraph of text or some kind of table or graph or something like that. And again, I did some research on Medify to see the average time spent on each of those questions. And what I first of all noticed is that the interpreting information questions, where it's just a paragraph of text, actually don't take that long to answer at all. The average was only 84 seconds, only slightly above the 60 seconds. Uh, but then if we compared that to interpreting information questions where we were looking at data, so it either had a table or a graph or something like that, then the average time to complete it went up to 167 seconds. So clearly, those questions are the longer ones and the ones we should skip if we are deciding to skip interpreting information questions. However, Venn diagrams could be another option for question types we skip, as these averaged 100 seconds. But the important thing to remember, of course, is that interpreting information questions are worth 2 marks if you get all 5 yes no statements correct, and then 1 mark if you get 4 of them correct. So, although interpreting information questions do take longer, because they are worth those 2 marks, it could be possible that they are actually better to answer first compared to Venn diagrams. And I think this is more of a personal preference thing. For some people, they take longer on the Venn diagram questions, and for them, it's worth it to skip those first instead of the interpreting information ones. For other people, they really don't like reading graphs, they really don't like reading tables, so it could be better to skip interpreting information questions first. So essentially with this, I just recommend you try it out. Again, I always recommend testing, reflecting, seeing what works best for you. So if you're still running out of time after skipping logic puzzles, then test either skipping the interpreting information questions, specifically the ones with data, so tables or graphs, and then potentially also the Venn diagram questions as well. And of course, you'd only want to skip the Venn diagram questions that actually look like they're going to take a while. Those are typically the ones where it's got the which of the following 4 statements is true, or the ones where you have to draw your own Venn diagrams to answer the questions. Those ones typically take longer as well. But the one thing I would say with Venn diagrams is they are also the questions that are answered with the highest accuracy out of any of the questions. 68% of them are answered correctly, which is why I tend to recommend skipping the interpreting information questions since they're only answered with an accuracy of 45%. So that's the kind of nuance there between which you skip after logic puzzles. But I think for 90% of students, logic puzzles should be the first questions you skip. Now, that's for students who typically find themselves running out of time on decision making. But what about students like myself who were aiming to answer all of the questions on decision making? Well, here my advice is actually slightly different, and it's something that I recommend the students aiming for those top marks try out. And that's essentially answering the questions in order, but not just because you're doing that arbitrarily, but doing that specifically so you answer the logic puzzles near the start of the exam and therefore cause your time to run out more, putting more time pressure on yourself for those later questions. So essentially, you're deliberately answering the longer logic puzzles near the beginning so you're lower on time and therefore forced to rush through the later questions. Now, that might seem a bit stupid. Why would you want to make yourself rush through the questions on decision making, right? But I think this can actually be a useful technique if you're kind of close to answering all of the questions but don't do it consistently. And that's because, as I said earlier, the Venn diagram questions at the end of the decision making section are often answered with a very high accuracy. Same for the statistical reasoning questions. Additionally, I think it's quite hard to make silly mistakes on these questions. Of course, if it was a type of question where you often make silly mistakes, you don't want to rush that, right? You want to take your time to make sure you guarantee yourself the marks. But personally, I found it very hard to accidentally select one of the wrong answers on a Venn diagram or statistical reasoning question because, of course, they are multiple choice. So if you do make a silly mistake, it's going to be obvious because your answer isn't going to be one of the choices, right? So what I actually found in myself is that when I had the time pressure on me, I would answer the Venn diagrams and statistical reasoning questions because of the whole idea of kind of Parkinson's law, where the time allocated to an activity is how long that activity will take, no matter the time. So essentially, if you have 5 minutes to complete a task versus 10 minutes to complete a task, you're going to be able to do it in 5 minutes, even if you had 10 minutes allocated to it, it would have taken you 10 minutes because essentially you speed up and force yourself to manage to do it in 5 minutes. You essentially look for creative ways to shorten the amount of time it creates when you have that time pressure on you. That wasn't the best explanation of Parkinson's law, but hopefully you get what I mean. Essentially, when you have that, say only 40 seconds to complete a question, you find a way to answer it in 40 seconds. And that's what I found for myself. I found that I was able to answer the questions a lot more quickly in under 60 seconds a lot of the time. And I was still able to answer most of them right. The fact that I was rushing didn't actually cause me to answer the questions with less accuracy. So I kind of used that to my advantage and made myself have that time pressure in the real exam by answering the logic puzzles first. And obviously it worked because I only got, I think, around 2 or 3 questions wrong on the official exam because of course I got 880. So if you are somebody who is aiming to answer all of the questions on decision making, maybe sometimes you get there, sometimes you don't, try that out. Try putting that extra time pressure on yourself for those Venn diagram and statistical reasoning questions and see whether you are able to answer them with that still high level of accuracy whilst being under more time pressure. Of course, if your accuracy starts to drop, then you're probably going to want to go back to answering the logic puzzles last. I do think answering logic puzzles last should be the default for most students just because it's a more safe strategy, right? But try it out, see what works for you, as with anything in the UCAT. And yeah, write a comment as well. See what works for you. Let me know because I'm always looking to get kind of more data, more student perspective on this kind of stuff.